So let's get right down to it, and let's talk about, first of all, trains, and in particular the train on the cover of the book. Let's sort of do a little bit of a thought experiment here. Let's pretend we're all on that train. We're all aboard, very, very comfortable, incredibly powerful, sleek engine. It's the entire sort of modern Western technological society, the whole genius thing that we have built, roaring down the track as never before, with a speed and an elegance and a comfort really unprecedented in human history. Every whim, all the contents of all the world's libraries at the click of a button. Unbelievable comfort, unbelievable wealth in a lot of ways. There are very, very many good reasons for us to think as we hurtle down these tracks that there's really no good reason to move. This seems like a pretty good way to get around, really about the best way anyone's ever made to get around. And so understanding the necessity of switching tracks is very, very important. And the first sign you might have noticed if you've been paying attention as you're watching sort of the scenery roll by out the window is that off in the distance there's clearly some kind of precipice, some kind of drop-off. And really, actually, the more you look out, maybe you're finally no longer distracted by the onboard entertainment, you might notice that we're coming closer and closer, and really the track just seems to be moving closer and closer to that falling off. And there's really no way at this point to deny the train we're currently on is headed for that edge. And we're really having a lot of arguments now about how much further down the track we can get before we actually have to rethink what we're doing. And what I'm here to tell you about today is about the track on the other side of that precipice, on the other side of that chasm. And it's a very similar kind of train in the sense that it is equally fast, it is equally powerful. It works in some ways better than the train we're currently on, but it is on a sustainable track. It is veering away from that cliff's edge, and that's where we need to get to. Before I can discuss that too much, though, I need to explain the necessity of the jump and the nature of that chasm. And so I'm going to do this very briefly in three simple, fairly straightforward quotes. Obviously, in the book, I discuss it a bit more length. But basically what the chasm is the convergence of three crises that we're currently treating as separate crises, but are in fact products of the exact same, all the same conditions and all the same problems. We basically, it's a sort of fundamental existential crisis. Begins with the most famous part of the crisis, which is the financial crisis. And that's what we've been mostly paying attention to since 2008, what we're going to do about it, how we're going to get past it, how we're going to get back on that, regular track that we are normally on. And part of the reason I would argue we have not gotten fully back on that track is because what we witnessed was the first really big indications that the track itself is failing at a fundamental level. And so that's why the cycle is not returning quite the way we would like to think it is. And to give it just one quote, although there are many, very soon after the near total collapse of the global financial system in the fall of 2008, after the first of the big Wall Street banks had failed, George Soros was giving a talk in New York. He was part of a panel, and as he was explaining what he thought had happened, he said this. He said, "Markets were seen basically as self-correcting. That paradigm has proven to be false. So we're not only dealing with the collapse of a paradigm, but also with the collapse of a worldview." And the reason I think that's so important, as the kind of core of what's happening with the financial crisis, is that what he's getting at is we're not seeing what would be a normal cyclical change in the cycle. What we're seeing is the fact that basically the basis of the whole thing is no longer operable. That business as usual, whatever it is, whenever we get there, will not look like the business as usual that got us here. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One of them is the second piece of the crisis, which is the global energy crisis. And people have talked about this in a lot of different ways. It's this very kind of quiet, slowly unfolding, up and down kind of thing. But really, a lot of where we got to financially and economically to this point was a set of assumptions built on the seemingly limitless plenty of fossil fuels. Really, if you go from the pre-industrial age to the current time, what really happened was our ability to harness and use energy expanded to an extraordinary degree. One of the examples I use actually in the book is talking about the Erie Canal, one of the backbones of the modern industrial world in the 19th century. And the Erie Canal, when they first built it, was still largely a handmade affair. It was largely dug with handmade tools. The barges that floated the Erie Canal had to be loaded and unloaded by hand. You'd need a team of men, sometimes working for days at the port to unload one of these barges floating down the Erie Canal. After the discovery of fossil fuels, beginning with coal and then moving on to other sources, one guy working for a couple hours with a steam shovel at the port of, or a steam crane at the port of Chicago could do the work that was formerly done by these teams of men, and really convinced us with pretty good evidence that we could in fact grow limitlessly, that we could just sort of continue to expand and expand and expand. We could find more energy anywhere we needed it. And that brings us to the second quote, the second piece of that chasm, which comes to us from the 2008 IEA World Energy Outlook, the kind of Bible of energy forecasting, which read in the preamble, current global trends in energy supply and consumption are patently unsustainable, environmentally, economically, socially. Patently unsustainable. This is not usually the language of an IEA World Energy Outlook. This was kind of an extraordinary admission on their part that got lost in the financial chaos. There is no caveat or asterisk there for countries that happen to have a lot of the currently high demand resources. There's nothing in there that says if you are a self-proclaimed energy superpower, you get a buy on the patent unsustainability of our energy system. And in fact, if this was at all unclear, the IEA sort of doubled down in 2009, again, right in the opening executive summary. And and I'm sure you've all seen the IEA World Energy Outlook executive summary, but if you haven't, this line actually appears in larger font in both bold and italics. The days of cheap energy are over. That fundamental assumption, which is that we can always get more, that we can always expand this thing, is simply no longer true. And again, there's no caveat and there's no asterisk. It does not matter how much we find locked in shale. It does not matter how much we find in the north of Alberta or off the coast of Brazil. It cannot possibly replace the energy system that yielded this stuff almost by hand. If you've seen the movie There Will Be Blood, you could almost dig the oil out by hand. You now need extraordinary engineering and extraordinary finance to get at it, and you just can't grow that as fast as we once did. In fact, in 2009, I was doing some reporting on this, and I live in Calgary, meeting with a number of people who didn't want to be on record. So I can't name them, but I can tell you that a lot of them, and these were the guys on the geological side of things, the exploration managers, that sort of thing, a number of them saying more or less that. We went at $150 a barrel in the summer of 2008. We were going as fast as we possibly could to get this thing, all the energy and resources we could throw at it to expand the world's oil supply. And living in Calgary, I know that it got very hard to do really minor construction projects because you couldn't even get raw materials. They were all headed north to fuel the expansion of the oil sands. And even then, we kept supply flat. That was basically what we did. We kept it from declining. That continues to be mainly what we're doing, is keeping it more or less flat. So that's the second piece of the energy crisis. The third piece is the trump card. And the trump card is climate change. And there are a million different ways of looking at this one, some of which are more controversial than others, some of which have more noise around them than others. So to cut through the noise, when I talk about climate change and why climate change fundamentally demands this shift from one side of the chasm to the other, the term I like to use to kind of sum it up is ocean acidification, which is one of the least known and most incredibly critical things we are already witnessing happen. Not that might one day happen, but that are already happening as a result of anthropogenic climate change. Ocean acidification, if you're not familiar with it, refers to the process by which a quarter of all the carbon dioxide that we emit through our industrial economy gets absorbed back into the world's oceans, where it gets turned into a very weak carbonic acid. And over the course of the industrial age, we have reduced the world's oceans' mean pH from about 8.2 down to below 8.1. And there's no controversy about this as a scientific measure. It's simply true. That doesn't sound like much, but it's a logarithmic scale, so that's actually an enormous increase. It's something like a 40% increase in the acidity of the world's oceans. And recently, paleogeologists and coral reef researchers discovered that in fact around 8.05, and this is very clear in the historical record, around 8.05 on the pH scale, the world's coral reefs begin to break down in a single sort of process that is catastrophic and irreversible. Basically what happens, not to get too far into it, is that the corals and the algae that live on them can't make reefs in that particular pH scale, but pH level. And what this has meant 5 times in the geologic record is that all coral reefs have vanished from the earth. Basically, that you still had corals, you still had those algae, but they couldn't make reefs. A significant portion of everything that lives in the ocean traces its food chain back to those reefs. So this would be, basically a sort of existential crisis in the world's oceans. And Charlie Varon, this is the third quote, who's the retired chief scientist of the Australian Institute for Marine Sciences, believes we might be as close as 10, 15 years from what he calls the commitment point, the point of no return for the world's oceans. And that's why when he talks in the press these days, he says things like this: the science is clear, unless we change the way we live, the Earth's coral reefs will be utterly destroyed within our children's lifetimes. And so that's very, very clear to me where our current trajectory heads us. Business as usual takes us to a world without coral reefs by mid-century. And so that kind of gets at the nature and the depth of the chasm and the size of the leap we need to make, and brings us back to that train, how we get onto it, where it takes us. And my main example for what that train is, where it takes us, and how to get onto it is the largest major industrial nation that has made the jump so far, the one that's sort of furthest on its arc across that chasm, and that nation is Germany. The transformation of Germany in the last 10, 15 years has been nothing short of extraordinary. If any of you have spent any time there, it is incredibly clear on the landscape, and it illustrates these four laws of leap mechanics, as I call them, very, very clearly. How it is the basic principles of how you propel yourself across. And the first is that a chasm can only be crossed in a single leap. Germany did not, in essence, did not sort of make little steps around the edges and test things out and try things out. What they did was make an enormous commitment, primarily to renewable energy and more broadly to sustainability, beginning with their feed-in tariff in the year 2000. This is a term that's usually pretty familiar to Ontario audiences. You know feed-in tariffs, you've got one. I won't get too much into the debate around that, although we can talk about it after. But the simple fact of it is, 12 years after passing the world's first feed-in tariff, Germany is an altered landscape in many, many very, very admirable ways. If you go anywhere in Germany now, what you will generally find anywhere where there's the space is large-scale solar farms, large-scale wind farms, smaller-scale stuff all over the place. Germany, which is not particularly sunny, it's not particularly windy, it does not have a particularly large amount of open space, far less on all counts than Canada has. Germany is now the global leader in all of those categories. Really, almost any sustainability category, particularly at the industrial scale that you can think of, Germany has just sort of jumped to the lead. It starts with wind turbines and solar panels and runs all the way down to things like high-efficiency windows and everything else. Germany did this with the feed-in tariff, which is basically a leveling of the energy playing field. Basically says rather than figure out some way to apply a carbon tax or some other very politically difficult cap and trade system or whatever, we will simply reward the hell out of renewable energy and get it onto the grid. This did not, by the way, happen overnight for Germany. When you look at the kind of trajectory of the feed-in tariff, the really big change started about 4 or 5 years in. So Ontario, now 3 years into its regime, I wouldn't say is necessarily lagging behind so much as it hasn't hit its full stride. Anyway, in any case, Germany is now at 20% plus and growing with a bullet of its grid is now renewable energy, starting from about 4 or 5%, I think it was. By the way, the initial goal for 2012 was 12%. So at the start of 2012, they had already exceeded their initial goal, which some in government at the time thought was excessive. They've already exceeded it by an enormous factor. The current goal is now something like 35% by 2020. And that's really not even the most exciting. Yes, their greenhouse gas emissions are falling and all that, but that's really not the most exciting part on the ground level. On the ground level, what they've done is build the sort of foundations of the first green industrial economy. And this is what it looks like, of course. You've got 300,000 plus jobs, a $50 billion a year industry, growing on several tracks. There's a study out there suggesting that by 2020, when they hit that next target, you'll be looking at an industry in Germany, in renewables alone, not even getting into kind of the ancillary stuff, but in renewables alone, an industry as big as the auto industry. And this is in a country that, of course, has Porsche and Volkswagen and BMW and many other car companies. So this is no small feat. And more than that has been a lot of the sort of stuff that has happened, that wasn't really the core of it. The core of it was looking at energy technology, but what actually happened was a pretty enormous transformation of the way people live and work. This is a great example of it. This is Q-Cells, which used to be the world's largest solar cell maker until the Chinese came and flooded the market. And this is in an area called Solar Valley, just outside of Berlin. This is in the former East Germany, and this is an area of the former East Germany that once had the highest unemployment rate in all of Germany, something on the bad side of 30%. Starting at the start of the feed-in tariff, it's now at 15% and falling. Before I move on, by the way, there's lots of talk, if you follow this stuff in the press, about Germany scaling back on solar, and that being to some degree an indication that the feed-in tariff is not working. I won't go too far into it except to say the main reason they are scaling back on solar, two of them, I would say. One is global competition, which for most people who believe in free markets, that would be considered a sign of health, that the Chinese see such an enormous opportunity in this that they're flooding the market with solar panels at below their actual production cost. And then the second thing is that the current German government likes big, large, centralized stuff more than they like little solar panels here and there. And so that's why when you go to Germany today, if you're wondering, have they stopped investing in the feed-in tariff and in renewable energy, what you'll find is stuff like this. This is the port of Bremerhaven on the North Sea coast. This is the world's first serial production facility for offshore wind turbine bases. And that's where a lot of the big heavy lifting of this next phase of the feed-in tariff is being done in Germany, is in offshore wind. Something like 10 gigawatts of offshore wind will be added in the North Sea in the next 10 years. To put that sort of in perspective, me being from Alberta, this is how I put it in perspective. That's all of Alberta's grid, just in offshore wind, just in the next 10 years, just in the North Sea. There's already 1,500 jobs on the port of Bremerhaven in this industry, something like 20,000 by the time they're through. There's a $7.2 billion credit line that the German government has secured to finance this stuff. So anyone who thinks that they have backed off on the feed-in tariff hasn't been to Bremerhaven lately. By the way, you can't take pictures inside, but this is the kind of stuff they're building in here. As I said, this is just the base. And when you get inside, just from a sort of, the awe of industry point of view, it really is like watching Eiffel Towers in serial production, like a Henry Ford production line for Eiffel Towers. It's incredible, the pace and the scale of this. And it gets to a very key point, which is this is not just about renewable energy entrepreneurs and small companies. Who are the bunch of hippie radicals who are building these things? It's a company called Weserwind. Weserwind is a subsidiary of Georg Marienhütte, which is a 150-year-old German steel company. This is their core business right here. And I think that's an important point, particularly for an Ontario audience, is that as the feed-in tariff sort of matures into its grown-up phase, it's not just a couple little companies along the edges. You've got steel companies, glass manufacturers, big business kind of stuff starts to see the wisdom and the opportunity in this. And I think that's very, very important. And brings us to the second law of leap mechanics, which is that the sustainable horizon is only visible from the sustainable track. And what I mean by this is that you can't actually see all the opportunity that faces you until you kind of get there. You can't see there from here, as I like to say it. And to illustrate this, I'm going to tell you a tale of two cities. One that I would say, made the leap and one that emphatically has not. We'll begin with one that has not made the leap. This is the campus of the University of Toledo in Toledo, Ohio. One of the 3 or 4 most important solar research facilities on Earth. If you've ever heard of thin film solar, an enormous amount of the advanced research that went into thin film solar was done at the campus of the University of Toledo. A number of the big companies that are now building thin film solar started in incubators at the University of Toledo. Part of the reason why this isn't terribly well known, even in Toledo, is because they are sitting in the middle of several levels of government that could care less that they are doing all of the solar research in Toledo, Ohio. And so what that means, because they haven't seen the opportunity to make that jump, is that when you go to Toledo today, it kind of looks like this. And the reason I took this picture was to illustrate everything that isn't there. I'd come out of a meeting at a glass company headquarters in downtown Toledo, a 100-year-old glass company that was now playing with some really interesting stuff with dye solar, where you sort of paint the solar cells onto glass, and stepped out at 5:30 on a weekday, middle of a city of 300,000 people, and as you can see, there's literally not a thing moving. There is not a person on the sidewalk. There is not a car on the road. Toledo is basically just sitting there waiting for someone to recognize where it needs to go. The counterexample, the other city, very, very similar starting point, is Bitterfeld, Germany. Bitterfeld, Germany was the center of the East German chemical industry. If you were living in the Soviet bloc and you bought things like photographic film, it was made in Bitterfeld. They were very proud of that. AGFA discovered color film there. But of course, under the Soviet regime and under the East German regime, it was neglected in terms of technological innovation, neglected massively in terms of environmental legislation. This was declared the dirtiest city in Europe in the 1980s. And no one disputes that in Bitterfeld, by the way. The person who told me that was actually an officer from their economic development office who was sort of backhandedly proud that Bitterfeld was once the dirtiest city in Europe. And the reason he was kind of proud of it is because this is sort of the big game in Bitterfeld today. This is that solar valley that I mentioned. This is the center of it, this new research and development and production cluster for the solar industry. And this was definitely not on anyone's horizon when Germany passed the feed-in tariff. No one said, as they were formulating that document and passing that legislation, you know what this will do is massively reduce unemployment in Saxony. What happened was that when entrepreneurs went looking to start companies, there were some tax incentives to set up businesses in East Germany, and it turned out in Bitterfeld in particular, there was this idle workforce that had an expertise in depositing chemicals on glass, which is exactly what you need to do to make solar panels. And so suddenly, several thousand local workers had jobs to do. No one, as I said, would have seen this. And in fact, the big growth industry until 2000 in Bitterfeld was the logistics of moving people out of Bitterfeld. I actually met a gentleman who that was his first business. He was in East Germany. He was an Aussie, and as the wall fell, he started up a business where if you'd moved to the West and gotten a job, he would pack up your whole apartment for you and take it to you. And that was his first business. His second business is property development, and this is what he's doing today. He's a part investor in this. This is the new waterfront in Bitterfeld. They filled in the old coal quarry, built a little promenade. They're now building new condos to hope to attract some of the workers who are now coming to work in Solar Valley. This was absolutely unimaginable 15 years ago, that Bitterfeld, of all places, might see new waterfront development. It didn't even have a waterfront at that point, for that matter, out of this feed-in tariff. And so that's that sustainable horizon you can't see from the unsustainable side of the chasm. It brings us to the very closely related third law of leap mechanics, which is that a quantum leap cannot be measured with a yardstick, which is a kind of a cute phrase, but I don't just mean it as a cute phrase. What I mean is that we have built a system of measurements for our success and failure in the global economy that primarily exists to encourage the status quo to carry on as it would like to. A lot of that stuff is deeply biased toward encouraging us to continue doing what we want to do. One great example of this is how we price energy, which is so Byzantine that I've said this in front of many audiences. I'll say it again. If you can come up to me afterward and show me on an Ontario hydro bill, or they're not Ontario hydro bills anymore, but an Ontario power bill, what part's the feed-in tariff and what part's the cost overruns on nuclear power plant refurbishments, I would love to hear it, because no one can, as far as I know. I've not seen any reliable data on that, and I'd love to. If you have it, I mean that. But to get to sort of down to earth on this, what I mean by quantum leaps and yardsticks, if all you were doing is counting what is the best marginal cost of a few more megawatts of power? Well, would solar make a lot of sense in northern Germany, in southern Germany even? You're still very far north. You're still further north than we are standing right here. Probably not. That probably wouldn't be but you could probably figure out a way to do coal with a certain amount of really good smokestack mitigation and that kind of thing, and it would probably be a better way to do it. But there's all kinds of ancillary stuff you wouldn't be seeing because you're measuring it the wrong way. And a great example of that is what it is meant for the German homeowner to be a participant now in energy production. And this is an enormous difference, by the way, between Ontario and Germany. A huge focus out of the gate in the German feed-in tariff was to get average German homeowners putting solar panels on their roof. In fact, they started it before the feed-in tariff with a 100,000 solar roof program. And what that did was not just get a few megawatts of solar on the grid, but introduce at a kind of broad public level the opportunity that was emerging. And then you started getting stuff like this. This is a neighborhood called the Solar Siedlung. It's in Freiburg in southern Germany, one of the sunnier parts of Germany. And it was built from the ground up, not just to make power, but to be a net energy producing neighborhood. And in fact, it is. Every single unit, there's 58 in the neighborhood, every single one of them over the course of a year produces more energy than it consumes. Every single one of them. And in fact, significantly more. And I used to say this. I actually, it was in my previous book, The Geography of Hope, that I first visited this neighborhood. And often I would give talks like this, and someone would come up afterward and say, look, is that ideal conditions? Is that theoretically they could maybe do that if it was a very sunny year or whatever? And I was pretty sure that wasn't the case, but the next time I went back, I made this nice German couple show me their power bills so that I could verify for myself that, in fact, yes, over the year 2008, this particular couple used 750 euros worth of energy. That was their total outlay for energy use because of the very, very efficient buildings that they're in and that sort of thing. And they made about 3,800 euros. So the net profit on the house from the solar system was something like $4,500. That's currently paying off the solar system. They are very, very close to having paid it off, and sometime in the next year or so, that'll turn to about 10 or 15 years of pure profit on their house. And I often think this would be a great place to start the conversation if we could reset it about feed-in tariffs in Canada. Don't we want houses that function as power plants? Don't we want to make money off our houses by making energy? Of course, it's not just the way they make power. The way they use power as well has shifted, and enormous opportunities have emerged out of that. This particular neighborhood in Freiburg, that was sort of a subdivision of a neighborhood called Vauban. Vauban is a repurposed military base outside of Freiburg. Everything in this picture, though it doesn't look like it, everything in this picture was built in the last 10 years. Built very, very carefully to be incredibly energy efficient. Every single building in the neighborhood uses at most 30% of the German average, and the German average is already pretty good. As you can see, they brought tram lines in. Occurred to someone rather brilliantly that if you let the grass grow between the tracks, it reduces the noise and actually looks quite nice. And along the way, the people living in this neighborhood decided they didn't really need their cars. So the thing that Vauban is actually most famous for, and the reason that they got named, everyone in the neighborhood got named a hero of the environment by Time magazine in 2009, which they find incredibly amusing. The reason for that was because it was the neighborhood without cars. And it's true, some of the people who live their own cars, you park them at the edge of the neighborhood, and all that great public space is freed up to do other things with. So much more than just the way they make energy changed. And that's the important point about this quantum leap being measured with a yardstick. If all you're doing is counting kilowatt hours, yeah, you can probably make the slide rule tell you that it makes sense to build another coal plant, but you're not going to get to this. And that brings us to the fourth law of leap mechanics, that a leap is powered not by a disruptive technology, but by a disruptive technique. And what I mean by that is that it's not about solar panels and wind turbines and the rest of it. If you look at what Germany has done, nothing they did involved significant technological innovation out of the gate. They used existing stuff. They brought economies to scale to bear. They brought German engineering to bear, certainly. But it wasn't about some sort of great sort of technological innovation. Really what it was a sort of rethinking of priorities and a really sort of brilliant strategic move to get to the other side of this chasm. And if I were to sort of sum it up, there's a lot of things that happened. But to keep it short and brief, if I had to sum it up, how did Germany make this leap? It did actually begin with one guy who you can point to if what you actually care about is who, of any politician of the last, let's say, 30 years, who has actually done stuff on the ground to get us over that chasm, to really seriously attack the problem of climate change and energy security. It's this guy, Hermann Scheer. Hermann Scheer was a backbench politician for the Social Democrats for many years, never held a cabinet office. He was just a very, very wise strategist and knew how to move people in the direction he wanted to move them. And what Scheer's leap, this sort of disruptive technique to Scheer's mind, was to recognize really right off the bat that, first of all, climate change was an existential threat to humanity, and second, that we would never get past the climate problem by talking about the climate problem. In fact, Hermann Scheer was the only member of any party in the German parliament, of any party, and he's an old lefty, who voted against ratifying Kyoto. And he did that in the mid-'90s when that was considered incredibly blasphemous by his traditional political allies. And when you asked him why, he would say, and had been saying since the mid-'90s, what's going to happen with this Kyoto thing is that we are going to create an enormous debating society for the world's energy bureaucrats and energy executives, and it will tie up in knots and will never move anywhere. You will never get coordinated action on that scale. And in fact, he's been proven more or less right. What he saw instead was that climate change was fundamentally a question of energy, how we make it, how we use it. That switching to renewable fuel, and this is key, would cause a structural change of the global energy economy. And there's a whole bunch of ways to sort of think about that structural change, but one of the ways I like to think about it, if you think about a coal plant, all of the value add in a coal plant is in getting and burning the stuff. It's about finding it in the ground, digging it up, refining it, burning it, and then delivering it to customers. That's where all of your value is in that part of the chain, whereas all of the value in renewables is in technological innovation, technological production, building the equipment, and installing it. Once you've done that, you no longer have that same kind of constant sort of profit cycle of needing to find more fuel, needing to feed it, and all that sort of stuff. So it's a structurally different way of thinking about energy, and this is why I think we run into a lot of these hiccups as we move toward renewable energy, because we continue to try and make it fit into the old measurements and not sort of look at it as a fundamentally different thing. The other thing Scheer recognized was that making this switch was not a burden, but was in fact an opportunity to replace scarce, expensive primary resources with new technological devices, basically replacing this technological innovation, for example, in the oil and gas field, which is entirely about finding and getting this stuff. I mean, I've been to the facility outside of Edmonton that does nothing but try and make upgrader technology work better at turning bitumen into syncrude. Instead, you're replacing with a whole new kind of power system. And then the final thing that Scheer recognized in his leap was that it would not be accomplished, this leap, by burden sharing among conventional energy bureaucracies and energy companies, but by basically establishing a new industrial foundation and building from there. And he saw this very early on. if you read the part on Shearer in the book, I held back from just how glowing I wanted to be about it. He's probably the most brilliant strategist I've ever had occasion to interview, and really kind of saw this stuff 10, 15 years ahead of anyone else and made it happen. I'd like to talk about how that disruptive technique works when you make that big jump to sustainability. This is a thing we talk about in business a lot, that we're going to get some sustainability. We're going to bolt on some sustainability to what we're doing. But if you make that big shift, that disruptive technique to say we're going to think about sustainability as the bottom line, as the sort of framework or paradigm for the whole thing, you get to very, very different places that are largely positive. And a great example of that is Unilever's new European headquarters in Hamburg. This is the European headquarters for Unilever, giant global consumer product manufacturer. Unilever wanted a new headquarters, and although they are sort of a green-minded company, they did not go and put out a design brief saying, build us the greenest office complex in Europe. Although they've sort of gotten to that. What they said was, and this was the core, this was the main thing they wanted done for the new headquarters. They said, our current headquarters, the guys in the 15th floor and the guys in the 17th floor never see each other, never talk to each other. Unless we call a meeting, there's just no interaction at all. So build us a building that really encourages that sort of informal interaction and informal collaboration. And it happened to fall to a German architecture firm that was obsessed with sustainability, as almost all German architecture firms now are. And they decided, let's build this under a conventional sort of office building brief, but let's do it where we're optimizing for sustainability. So if we have to use cheaper materials to get to the sustainable stuff, we'll do that. If we have to cut back on some of the other luxuries to get to the sustainable stuff, we'll do that. And what they got was exactly what Unilever wanted by different means, and that's that disruptive technique at work. This is a great example of it. This is the main central atrium of the building. It is a very welcoming work environment, but what's mainly happening here is all sustainability stuff. There's right here we've got some fantastic solar gain going on and a whole ton of light flooding in, so minimizes the amount of light that the building needs and minimizes the amount of heat that the building needs and cooling as well. This thing is not decorative. This is actually a reflector that is pushing that sunlight into the corners of the atrium and through those office windows to massively reduce the amount of artificial lighting that you need. Two great things about that: one, energy, and two, people don't like spending all day in artificial light. It makes them kind of jumpy. And that was actually the architect when I was talking to him. He said when we were designing this building, it occurred to us, you spend 8 hours a day or more in your office, so you really shouldn't be designing office spaces. You should be designing living spaces for work, because you're in there as much as you are in your home, and you really should be thinking that way from the ground up. And so by doing that, they managed to actually perfectly fulfill Unilever's design brief. As you can see, there is all this great informal collaboration and bumping into each other and talking through the problem going on. This looks, by the way, I know, like it's the corporate brochure picture that they gave me to go and tell them, hey, it really happens. But in fact, this was me walking through the building at 4 o'clock on a rainy afternoon, around the time in a lot of offices people are playing Angry Birds and watching the clock. And in fact, all of this collaboration and everything else they said would happen is happening in part because they built such a great space that people like to linger in it. You're not in a hurry to get out of it. You're not trying to escape it. And you wind up having that extra little bit of conversation or whatever that leads to the kind of interaction that Unilever was after all along. As my sort of final example of sustainability in the workplace and in business, I'm going to finally jump back over the pond to North America. And in fact, all the way over to the kind of biggest guy in the room in North American business, Walmart, as an example of what this disruptive technique of sustainability does to a business. Walmart in 2006 committed itself to a sustainable bottom line on a somewhat open time frame, but it was a very, very ambitious bottom line. The bottom line is 100% renewable energy, producing no waste, and selling only sustainable products within some manageable time frame. And they put very, very concrete goals in right away, and this was met by enormous scoffing, still is met by enormous scoffing, particularly by the green community, who thinks, Walmart, could you name a business more unsustainable than Walmart? And Walmart, in fact, came to this decision in part because they recognized that. And from a business point of view, recognized that they were vulnerable on a whole bunch of fronts to big changes that were coming, and that you couldn't just keep pushing it out and out and out on the current trajectory. And they were actually very, very careful about it. They didn't even start talking about it until they were a couple of years in. You name a sort of A-list green consultant, he has at some point, or she has at some point, made the pilgrimage to Bentonville to talk them through some stuff. They've really thought hard about it. There's still tons about their business I don't like, you might not like, that is fundamentally unsustainable. But the actual change has been pretty impressive, even just 5 or 6 years on. The big problem they're running into, of course, is how do you even grade the sustainability of a set of patio furniture, or a ballpoint pen, or a carton of milk? I mean, Walmart sells everything. How do you figure out the sustainability? You can't just arbitrarily say this stuff is and this stuff isn't. So they're actually doing some of the work of government in a lot of ways by sending these sustainability scorecards to all their suppliers, saying, tell us how your whole business process works, and we're going to figure out a way to grade it. And this has proved to be incredibly difficult. But I mean, really, if once they've cracked it, it will be probably copied broadly, because who but Walmart could possibly muster the resources to do all of that. In the meantime, in-house, they've actually done some pretty amazing things. One of them in Canada, actually just outside my hometown of Calgary. This is the new Walmart distribution center, fresh food distribution center for Western Canada, built from the ground up in just the last couple of years. And basically what you're looking at is an enormous refrigerator freezer. It's got a refrigerated area for produce, and then a huge frozen goods thing, and that's all of the Walmarts in Western Canada. This is where that stuff lands and gets distributed. But what you notice, of course, first of all, is that there's a ton of solar and wind and all kinds of other stuff going on, and that's because they decided in-house, Walmart Canada, separately from the parent Walmart, because there was this disruptive technique of sustainability now in the works, decided let's build the kind of global model of a sustainable warehouse. Green warehouse, and did all kinds of stuff that lots of pilot projects have been thrown at, but no one has ever done with quite the sort of panache that Walmart did it. And so when you go inside, some of the more impressive stuff is harder to see. It looks like a pretty standard warehouse in a lot of ways, but there's a few things going on. You've got your forklift over here. That's hydrogen powered. That's one of the first, probably not the very first, but one of the first where there was no government partner encouraging the use of hydrogen as a primary fuel source. That Walmart just went and did it. There's amazing things happening with the way these doors keep heat transfer from happening, so that the building isn't constantly losing its cold or gaining too much heat, or whatever else. They basically redesigned from the ground up the way that interface works, and it's near perfect efficiency now. They lose almost no, they see almost no temperature change at all as the truck backs up to take on the stuff. And there's a really amazing thing in this building. When you come into it, they knew it would be kind of a magnet for other companies to come and see what they were up to, and so they built a little kind of museum-like thing that explains all the systems. And there's these boards that explain everything that's going on. And one of the most remarkable things about the hydrogen-powered forklifts and all the sort of interior machines is that they actually truck the hydrogen from Quebec to Alberta. And the reason they did that was because they did a life cycle analysis of the total carbon footprint of all the different ways they could make hydrogen. And it was actually a smaller footprint to make it from, basically Quebec's pure green grid, or almost purely green grid, and then truck it to Alberta, than to use Alberta's grid is primarily coal. It was a larger carbon footprint to use Alberta's grid. And so there's this great thing where they explain why they're doing that. And it reads, I'm going to read it in full. As Alberta increases its renewable energy production and decreases its coal energy generation, manufacturing hydrogen in Alberta may become a more viable option. I love that. This is Walmart basically elbowing the Alberta government in the ribs and saying, come on, get with it. I mean, this is not a bunch of environmentalists playing around now. This is the way business is going to go now. And you guys need to get with it. You need to be thinking about this stuff. By the way, Walmart, it's not just their warehouses. One of the first big wins for Walmart was its trucking fleet. This is where the really low-hanging fruit was. Among other things, they realized that the trucks were being left on basically idling in parking lots all night while the drivers watched TV and kept warm or whatever else. And so simply by putting smaller alternate generators in all the trucks, they're saving $26 million a year. Just simply by the easiest little troubleshoot in the world. One of the other things that happened was they started optimizing their deliveries not for speed, and efficiency so much as for sustainability, which included speed and efficiency, but also included fuel use and waste and that kind of stuff. And they very quickly realized there was a way to kind of redo the way they distributed all their goods, where you used a lot less fuel and you waited till the truck was full. You packed it much more carefully so that you got a full load every time, and that sort of thing. And because it's Walmart, the numbers are always pretty amazing. The savings last year in the U.S. alone, by the way they changed the way they load their trucks and send deliveries, was like about $200 million. So this is why Walmart is in this business, is not because they turned into tree huggers overnight, is because they saw a way to save hundreds of millions of dollars by rethinking the way they did stuff from the ground up. And this is, by the way, one of those things you see in a lot of places where, you know, there's this whole other goal that you're aiming at, and you wind up landing on sustainability somehow. This is another great example of it. This is Amazon's new frustration-free packaging. And the reason Amazon has done this is because they recognize that a very, very common consumer complaint for them was that stuff arrived next to impossible to get at. And we've all, I'm sure, experienced that, where you've got the one little cord you need for your computer and you need some sort of, you know, machete or something to kind of get at the thing. So Amazon recognized that this was a way that they could improve customer satisfaction, and then along the way they realized not only could you improve customer satisfaction, but you could massively reduce the amount of packaging. You could replace a lot of petrochemical products with recycled paper, and hit all these sustainability goals in pursuit of lighter, easier to open packages. And so the aim was basically customer satisfaction. They just used that disruptive technique of sustainability to get at it. And my final example, similar idea, also connects to Walmart, is a local story. Some of you who have kids might recognize these. These are Bakugan. And Bakugan are made by, or designed anyway, by a company called Spin Master, based here in Toronto. That was started out of a dorm at I think it was the University of Western Ontario. About 15 years ago, is now the world's #3 toy maker. And Spin Master fairly early on decided to start doing things like eliminating PVC from their packaging, massively reducing the amount of packaging. All of these things, in part because they wanted, you know, some sustainability stuff, but also in part because it just sort of made good business sense. And along the way, they found that their biggest customer, Walmart, was very pleased with what they were doing and strongly encouraged it. And they're now actually 99% compliant with Walmart's sustainability scorecard. So as everyone else in the industry is, you know, going to have to scramble to meet these new sort of standards, they're already ahead of the game. Again, simply by recognizing that it made excellent sense as a new bottom line to organize a business this way. And I think that would be, you know, where I will leave it. That's the sort of core of the leap, is that what we are talking about here is not how to distribute the burden. We are talking about enormous business opportunities. Some stuff more than others, but really the key message is that we need to make this transition. We have absolutely no choice but to make it. And in fact, everyone who's making that transition is finding that they are landing in a place of renewed prosperity, greater opportunity, huge improvements in terms of any number of factors, not just environmental factors. And that is why, you know, I think this is the sort of great project of our time, is making this leap from one side to the other. And I will leave it there. We've got a little bit of time for your questions in a minute, but thank you all very much.
In Germany, those guys are getting money for their electricity generation. So in Ontario, the microfit program does something sort of similar. What will happen is when the legislation changes so that it's not fixed in terms of, like, you know, the cost pricing, and now you have, like, you know, like variable pricing coming in.
Well, in Germany, you mean? Well, basically wherever you entered the feed-in tariff is where you stay. So if you connected your solar panels at, you know, the 2008 rate, that's a 20-year guarantee. And what they haven't started introducing variable pricing so much as they tweak every 4 years, sometimes faster than that. They tweak the rates across different power sources to sort of encourage more of one and less of another. Part of what they just did was reduce the rate for new solar. So what happened there was a bit of shakeout in the industry, and there's far fewer roofs in Germany being covered by solar panels, which, you know, some would argue kind of makes sense for a not particularly sunny northern country to begin moving some of its investment elsewhere. but the intention is that basically you won't have a sudden jump from one regime to another. What you'll have is this sort of gradual phasing out and scaling down and bringing in and pushing out as things make market sense or don't make market sense or whatever. In the solar case, I don't completely agree with it, but what the German government decided was, we're doing too much of this stuff, and we're doing it using German-made solar panels that cost more than Chinese-made solar panels and everything else, and so let's scale that back and start moving big into offshore wind. In part, I would argue because the German government, conservative German government, was getting a lot of blowback from big energy companies. And those big energy companies like to do big offshore wind farms. They don't get much out of small-scale solar. So there's several different things going on. But one thing I would sort of point out on that note, and I talk about this in the book, is the difference between the way the feed-in tariff works, even in Ontario, where I think it's there's certain things that could be kind of fixed around the edges, versus some of the other ways that we've figured out to do a lot of renewable energy development. The great example of this for me is Iowa. Iowa in 2007, 2008, 2009 was one of the fastest growing regimes for wind in the world. There was a ton. Iowa was the number 2 by raw generation power in the United States, second only to Texas, far and away number 1 per capita. And the reason for that is because Iowa's got good wind. It's close to Chicago, so it's got a ready market right there. And then the third thing was that there was, the Iowa government had put some stuff in place, and there was, it wasn't quite a feed-in regime, but there was sort of a renewable portfolio standard that was encouraging the development of wind. And then there was the last little bit of the kind of, to make the market case to build, to go and do an installation was a federal tax credit that had to be renewed every couple of years. And that federal tax credit vanished into the derangement that was the 2010 congressional campaign in the United States, and Iowa ground to a halt, or just literally not a single new development once that thing expired, and there was just this sudden lurching halt right at the moment where you had every community college in Iowa was training wind technicians. People were getting really excited about it. Farmers were loving having this stuff on their land. Some of the case I talk about in the book is the town of Newton, Iowa, which had nearly fallen completely apart when Whirlpool pulled out. Literally had taken one of the old Whirlpool plants and turned it into a wind turbine component plant. And right at the point where all of that stuff was really beginning to sort of hum along, it just ground to a complete halt and hasn't come back since, because they're still arguing about whether we should be subsidizing wind. So I don't. My understanding, the feed-in tariff doesn't suddenly lurch to a halt like that. You can stop new growth, but it moves at the rate it's moving. So yes, I would argue it is sustainable in the sense that it is designed to be changeable and is not sort of a single rigid system that if market conditions change, you can't adjust.
What do you forecast in Ontario's future based on the current state of the track we're on? And with that being said, there is also mixed political support with the current feed-in tariff program, which is a big nightmare for most of the industry, and at the same time, it's keeping us from where we need to go. So what do you forecast? At the same time, if you had the opportunity, what advice would you give to Ontario with the feed-in tariff program in mind?
Well, depending on who I'm talking to, I'm talking specifically to the Ontario government. I would tell them that one, they should probably do some triage at this point, which I understand they're doing to some degree, but sort of recognize that they didn't champion this stuff as well as they could have, and that there are entire parts of the province that they need to go back in at like a community hall scale and start meeting with people and talking to them about ways to get community investment so that it's not this incredibly divisive thing. One of the huge differences between Ontario and, as far as I know, every single regime in Europe, and there are lots of them that have done a lot of wind, not just Germany. In fact, Denmark's done more, Spain and Portugal have done more, is that huge blowback. You get a little bit of NIMBYism in parts of Europe, but not this sort of hue and cry. And I think a lot of that had to do with the way the Ontario feed-in tariff program was kind of designed for a number of reasons to be top-down. It was a lot of big installations right out of the gate. I'm certainly, and which brings me to the second thing I would tell the Ontario government and anyone working in that industry, which would be lobby to get better bureaucratic cooperation for smaller scale installation. That seems to me to be the thing that Germany did that Ontario didn't. Which is, I mean, you had people. My understanding is out of the gate very keen to get involved in this, but you'd have the installer, you'd have the kit, you'd have the application, and then you would sit waiting for months and months and months for the reluctant permission of the Ontario energy bureaucracy to actually connect this thing and begin making energy. And that's one of the big differences that in most of Germany you didn't have these enormous sort of centralized gatekeepers on that stuff. There's a lot of municipal level utilities in Germany that can just hook stuff up to their own grid, and a lot of them did. And that's why you see a German village and a solar farm right outside it. It's owned by the municipal utility, which is actually making money by having done so. And so I would say those are the two big things: much more community scale involvement and a much better more streamlined bureaucratic process. That second part is not something. I mean, you would need all of the best minds in organizational behavior in this building and many others, I think, to crack some of that part, but I think it's doable. And I think particularly, it did get through that first kind of resistance, and it's, so start over from this point saying, let's make it work now. And how can we make it work now for people and get past some of that resistance? Because one of the great things that certainly has happened in Germany and a number of other European countries is it's not a political left or right issue anymore. Everyone sees this as a core business, sort of going forward, and so you don't get that kind of outrage. I don't think that's too strong a term for it. One of the other things too is just on a quick side note would be to say that I think part of the reason why you need that kind of community scale, and if I was working for one of those companies, and when I talk to guys from those companies, I say you've got to, get into some of these meetings, because I mean there was I can't remember the name of the community college in Belleville. Does anyone know the name of the community? I can't remember, but there's a video on the internet that basically this journalism student at the Belleville Community College made, where the video begins at Prince Edward County community meeting about new wind turbines, and people are just ferociously angry and screaming things out, and there's all kinds of this stuff that's being sort of agreed to by most of the room as true. Among other things, this is just the example that he actually follows, that the exhibition ground wind turbine is not connected to the grid, and that it in fact has a gas turbine inside it that is spinning it. And there was a chunk of that audience believed that was true. And he actually goes with the technician up into the nacelle of the thing and says, "Where's the gas engine?" And the guy says, "What are you talking about, a gas engine? This is an engine. You're standing in an engine." But it gives you an indication of just how far out of whack that conversation got. And so I think even before you can do anything, some sort of effort to bring that sort of conversation back to some sort of even footing about what's actually true and false and where the opportunity lies would be really important.
My question is that you talk about the tremendous opportunity to be realized through the leap by the businesses. Mm-hmm. But what would be your advice for the governments? What kind of a role you think they should play in that transition aside from energy?
So what could they be doing aside from energy production, you mean? Or
aside from the feed-in tariff program and
mm-hmm.
anything that has to do with energy? I mean, what you were talking about in terms of Walmart's transition towards sustainability, what can
mm-hmm.
what more can the governments do?
Well, I mean, there's tons the government should do. I think they should be just rewarding the hell out of any business that wants to make this jump, and you can do that in tax rebates. You can do that in co-financing and things like that. Some of which I think gets done, but it gets done sort of unevenly. Certainly, the federal government's constant back and forth on whether or not you're going to reward, for example, homeowners for making their houses more efficient is ridiculous, and a consistent recognition. One of the things that's been really, really powerful in Germany, especially, but kind of Europe-wide, has been building codes that far exceed even some of the most ambitious stuff that we're doing here. That just basically saying, well, if our goal is to use a lot less energy, let's legislate using a lot less energy. And maybe you can't do that all in one go, but you could certainly put enormous rewards into the system for anyone who wants to make this and make this transition from the homeowner to the small business owner, all the way to big business like Walmart and those sorts of companies. So I think, I can't think of, I think that's highly variable and idiosyncratic from, jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But really, if you decide, and this is this thing I keep talking about, this disruptive technique, if you've decided truly what we want is a cleaner energy future, what we want is a sustainable bottom line, those questions get solved really quickly. How do you differentiate between, a great example of this was the federal government's economic stimulus thing, where there were these big rebates put in place to do any home improvement at all. So, you wanted to put a new bathroom in that was really fancy, that counted. You wanted to put solar panels on your roof, that counted. Why wouldn't you if you actually cared about this stuff, why wouldn't you say, hey, let's put let's put all the reward, or at least most of it, toward things like insulation and better windows and all the sort of stuff that you see happening because of the German building code. And actually, just as a final note on that, the Unilever building that I showed you, the architect who was showing me around that, we were sort of walking around, he's showing me all this stuff, and I said to him, how does this work? Is there like a LEED system in place or whatever? LEED being the leadership in efficiency and environmental design, which we now use as our green building code, voluntary green building code. And he kind of laughed and he said, German building codes oblige us to exceed LEED Gold on almost every count anyway. So why would we bother with these little voluntary programs? And that's why you see when you go to Germany, you talk to people in the building trades. No one's talking about should we do this, or it's all how do we do this. And I think that's the kind of stuff beyond just how we make what kind of energy systems we put in place. That's the kind of stuff government can really drive. Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.